We're going to start off with an overview by Akihiro Kanamori of Boston University, who will speak on Mathias and set theory.
Thank you very much. I was a research student of Adrian's from 1970 to 1975. I got my PhD in 1975, and it's great to be back yet again and to see my old haunts, and on this occasion to commemorate his 70th birthday, though I'm told that he's now 71. And so what I'd like to do is to as much as I can, to provide a dynamic, kind of theme-driven, comprehensive overview of his work, extending especially to the axiomatics of set theory, which I think is his deepest work, and it's ongoing from strength to strength, and even maybe touching on some of his more polemical, if you like, or rhetorical writing. Okay, so let me just say, well, a very brief overview. Adrian established his set theoretic legacy with the Mathias reel and the kind of theory of happy families and things that surround that theory. And then he went on to discuss certain matters about filters and certain things resonant with the axiom of determinacy thereupon. And at a later point, he reached another height when he got involved in dialectical engagement with work of Nicolas Bourbaki, and particularly with Saunders MacLean, and start to talk about and see the scope and limits of their set theories, and developed his own sense of its axiomatics. And he then pursued these matters. Well, there was a time also when he talked about dynamics, which I may not get into that much today, in deference to another speaker. And then he started to talk also about even weaker so-called micro set theories, in which he, in a sense, got at what is the minimal sufficient axiomatic requirements to have, for example, the development of the truth predicate in constructibility, and also the forcing predicate or relation for the theory forcing. Anyway, so just to give a very brief chronological description before I launch into more of the details, let me just say that first he came in 1965 to get his BA at Trinity College, and of course that was a time of great excitement in set theory because Cohen had just developed this notion of forcing in 1963. He, with enterprise and initiative, went and got a fellowship to work with Ronald Jensen in Bonn, then as now, I suppose one could say, the preeminent set theorist in Europe. And, oh, let me just mention, I have time. I'm very happy that he engaged in that because he established my own intellectual pedigree. And Ronald Jensen and I have talked about this particular hierarchy, but the arrows indicate a direct lineage of Dr. Vader, Dr. Sonnen, and I'm very happy to say we go all the way back to Leibniz. So Ronald was a student of Hassenjäger, studied piano arithmetic, who was a student of Heinrich Schultz, a theologian who kept logic alive in the Second World War. He is reputed to have established Phrygian archives in Münster, though I don't know exactly the state of affairs there. Then there are several religious philosophers. Bertolt Fischer is known for his interpretation of Kant. And then, of course, we have the swath of German idealism, Hegel, Schelling, Fichte, and then Kant himself, and then Martin Nutzen, and the well-known philosopher von Wolff, and then Leibniz. Okay. Leibniz also he wrote a thesis with Christian Huygens, the Dutch physicist, though it's not clear exactly the relationship of Dr. Father or son at the time anymore. One could also say that his Dr. Father was God, so we could stop there. There is an alternate reality in which if you claim genealogy back to G.H. Hardy, you can also claim it all the way to Newton. And so, of course, you could perpetuate a certain rivalry at that point between Newton and Archimedes. Anyway, back to more staid matters. He, with Jensen, I believe, ventured into the New World from Bonn. Well, he did a lot of work already to accumulate a lot of set theory during that time in Bonn. And he and Ronald went to Stanford. Well, before then, they went to that famous UCLA conference in set theory, where he actually gave his first paper, already conversant in set theory, with forcing rather. We talked about the independence of so-called order extension principle from the ordering principle, and there's a nice paper already still cited. Anyway, so he then spent the year at Stanford University, and he put down to paper a very timely survey, no, what is it? I forgot. Anyway, as a very fine paper, which he circulated in Zamizat form, only came out much later in an Hungarian journal. Anyway, so that time there was also a very formative seminar of Dana Scott, which I'll come to later. And back in Bonn, he wrote up very quickly his work on Ramseyness and Solovey's model on a generalization of Ramsey's theorem. He submitted it to Trinity College for fellowship. It didn't quite succeed, but then it was fortunate because then for the next year he went to the University of Wisconsin at Madison and got acquainted with the work of Kunin, David Booth on ultrafilters and combinatorics. And then back next year he applied once again for fellowship, this time to Peterhouse, and was given a fellowship for the duration of the next 20 years. All right, so during that time, I do mention that he actually was very supportive of set theory. There was a famous conference in 1971 of 3 weeks, which rivaled, in fact, the UCLA conference in depth and energy. And then later, I think it was 78, there was another conference that he organized. I was party to the organization of the first one as a research student. And then he, during this time, yes, the survey is called A Surrealistic Landscape with Figures. Anyway, so eventually he published the Happy Families paper during that period, and then also he did other work of a sort of building on that until he also, and then started to write certain more polemical writings, which I'll come to at that time. Then, unfortunately, I think he got into a sort of scap with the master, Hugh Trevor Roper of Peterhouse, and his fellowship was not renewed, upon which he whereupon embarked on certain l'année de pèlerinage through years of travel to different places, most stable in Barcelona. And in fact, this was times he devoted to set theory. It was really quite productive in some ways, though towards the end. In early 1999, he landed in La Réunion, you might say the farthest outpost of French imperialism, and he was tenured there, and I think in 2012 he was officially retired. I guess it's the case that Franz Doutre-Mer also is subject to the French centralized university system. Anyway, so there we are. So I'd like to discuss more in detail. This is his chronology, so I can refer to his wanderings. This actually is quite a wonder of fantasy. And I'd like to then talk a little bit more about, in more detail about his work one by one. Okay. So this, no doubt, is familiar to you, but I want to sort of pick up as if it were the time. Then we have the usual ordinary partition relation and Ramsey's theorem, and Erdős and Gyökeres sort of rediscovered the finite Ramsey theorem, and at the same solved the famous problem. Well, solved the problem in combinatorial geometry. At the same time, Erdős, still an undergraduate, at the last year of his undergraduate, wrote to Richard Rado already in Manchester, suggesting this far-reaching generalization, which is that there it is. Okay, that if the infinite subsets of omega are partitioned into two parts, there's an infinite subset of omega, all of whose infinite subsets are landing in one part or the other. So I'll call that, using a later terminology, the strong partition property for omega. Right, so when he wrote that letter to Richard Rado, Rado wrote back almost by return post the famous example using the axiom of choice, getting a counterexample to this property. So by then, the partition calculus of Erdős and his collaborators was always having to do with finite exponents. Okay. In the post-Cohen climate of the axiom of choice independence results, the young Harvey Friedman, in a seminar conducted by Dana Scott on partition relations in the autumn of 1967, newly raised the possibility of establishing the consistency of the strong partition property, and alerted to a related possibility raised by Scott of definable partitions that might have infinite homogeneous sets. Fred Galvin and Carl Prickery showed that if, well, first of all, a subset of a bunch of infinite subsets of omega is Ramsey if you could find one infinite subset, all of whose infinite subsets land in one or the other. So to say the strong partition property is to say that every subset of omega is Ramsey, and the famous Galvin-Prickery result is that if Y is Borel, then it's Ramsey, was soon raised to Y is analytic, then Y is Ramsey. So it's the first time in some way that something like with determinacy later, you have certain kind of definability things that are holding, and then the whole thing would eventually be also subsumed by axiomatics and consistency. So it's a little bit, the paper of Galvin-Prickery was only 1971, so I just wanted to clarify the dating of the situation. So all this was before Adrian, and in June of 1968, I believe, when he was back in Bonn, he put together the ideas of a model, Solve's model, together with a notion of forcing to come up with his famous result. So let me just go through that very quickly. So the Solve original model was 1965, only 2 years after Cohen's work, and Levy collapsed, as we all know, the and inaccessible to omega 1, and the key to his model is that if you have a set of reals definable from a real R, then there's a formula such that this is happening in the generic extension, some real is in Y, if and only if, just knowing about the parameter R and X, it must satisfy this formula. So you don't have to know everything about the entire model. Roughly speaking, as is known, if you have a small part of a Levy collapse, the rest is again a Levy collapse, and the Levy collapse is a homogeneous notion of forcing, so you don't have to know about a generic object, you just simply say the zero condition forces it, and that's what that formula says. So this is key to Solve's proof that all sets of reals are Lebesgue measurable in a certain inner model, those definable from a real parameters. And so that's the model, and Adrian, learned about the model from Silver and also worked with Jensen on it. And he then used his own notion of forcing, which was an adaptation of prickly forcing. The prickly forcing, I think, occurred in the summer of '67. Adrian knew about that, and he developed the version for omega. So again, if you have you have conditions SA, where S is a finite subset and A is an infinite set. So S sits below and A sits above, and conditions are extended by taking things from the above set and adding them and extending them until you get a real. Okay. So I think it's the case that Cohen's original forcing came, then random reals came with Solovey, and I think Mathias reals came third. Though I'm not sure about silver reals. I'm not sure where that goes. I'm not sure which one predated. Okay. Then Mathias opined there would have to be, because of Solovey's lemma, that Mathias wheel would work by showing that every infinite subset of a Mathias wheel would also be Mathias. So there are two properties. One is was called by Carlos de Prickly, and it is generally called the Prickly condition. And that's to say, if you have any formula, any condition, you don't have to extend the S, but just collapse a little bit the A to get a finer condition that decides the formula. So this was known to Carl Prickly, but it's a little bit more difficult to prove in this case, and Adrian came up with a notion of capturing for this purpose. And part B is often called the Mathias property, and so called in de Prisco's talk. If X is a model, if X is a Mathias wheel over a model and Y is infinite, then Y is also a Mathias wheel. Actually, Mathias property may have to do with the generating of a filter. But anyway, sort of two sides of the same coin. All right, so with that, you can actually show that every set of reals is Ramsey. For if you have a set of reals definable from a parameter, then in just the parameter, there's a Mathias condition so that it decides the formula by the Prickly property. And then, of course, that's with C, a canonical name just for the Mathias reason forcing language. Then there surely is in the full generic extension some real which is Mathias, which is included in that condition. And then by B, every subset is also going to satisfy the property, and therefore all subsets are in one side or the other. That partition S therefore defined. So as soon as you get definability, you can get all this to work out. All right. Now, so I think there's an important elaboration of this that occurred within a year with Booth and Kunin talking about Ramsey ultrafilter. So a Ramsey ultrafilter is an ultrafilter of omega, so that if you have the pairs of omega divided into two sides, there's actually a homogeneous set in U for the partition. And for filter F, F is Mathias forcing. F Mathias forcing is the forcing where the large set is always kept in the filter, so it's a little bit closer to Prickly forcing. So then, later in the Happy Families paper, but already developed in '69, I think he told me at Monash University in Australia, for a month he was there. If you have a real that's Mathias over a ground model V, it generates a Ramsey ultrafilter F over the power set in V. And if it's given in the, the Ramsey ultrafilters are given in this way, the set of things, so the Mathias wheel is almost included in the set. And generically adding just one Mathias wheel to V is equivalent to actually first adjoining F without adding any reals, and then doing F Mathias forcing over that inner model to get X. So this factorization was an important point that would lead to important structure results. So then he developed the notion of a happy family. He told me the term comes from John Crossley in Australia, and it's what was called a selective coideal. So you have the complement of an ideal, and if you have a bunch of sets descending in A, in the set A, then there's a Y that diagonalizes. So it's stronger than a little bit than almost included. I guess almost included in everyone is sort of like what's called a moderately happy family. Anyway, so there it is. So a happy family is just the sort through which one can force a Ramsey ultrafilter without adjoining any reals. Okay. So one can study happy families and talk about then adjoining Ramsey ultrafilters and then getting a Mathias wheel to code that, so to speak, and all that can be all in one large package. So I'd like to, of course, talk about various issues there, but I think there's been a lot already. So, I mean, first of all, just to summarize very quickly, this work, one could consider a measure of depth for mathematical work the amount of people that follow up and results that follow, given that structure provided. And there's the first wave with Ellen Tuck's topology, and even just building on happy families, Andreas Bloss did work which generalizes to not getting Ramsey ultrafilters, but general ultrafilters in this way. And then there's a second wave with Carlson and Simpson on Ramsey spaces, and lately, as we've heard from Carlos de Prisco, the work of Todorcevich and others on more abstract Ramsey spaces. And also in the direction of his paper and Malo cardinals, where he proved in the happy families that there are, if you have a Malo if you collapse a Malo, then you have no mad families. So we've heard from Asper Tornquist that you could do that from an inaccessible, and presumably you could do it from nothing, but that's a later story. And then there's still the question of whether for Ramseyness, let us say even for something like, I guess, sigma 1, 2, so a sigma 1, 3 sets or something, it's necessary to have the inaccessible, and that's, I think, the talk, or be included in the talk of, I think it was Günter Fuchs later today. So I won't talk about these matters, though. I'd like to move on from these. So there's, in other words, a great deal of theory that was built up from this work on happy families. Mathias wheels also themselves have become important in the pantheon of generic wheels. I guess they first may have occurred in print in the Martin Solovey paper, as I note here, when they proved in effect that P equals C, the pseudo-intersection number is the continuum under Martin's axiom. So they used a kind of a little bit disguised way of doing Mathias filter forcing. And let me mention here that Adrian has expressed the wish that the strong partition property be carved on his gravestone in due course. So of course this refers to, or I think it refers to the famous story of Archimedes in the Second Punic War, which is essentially the Second World War of the ancient world. Marcellus, the Roman general, enters Syracusa and asks for that famous man to be brought to him. And soldiers are sent to summon Archimedes. He is unheeding of any such things as he's looking over some sort of geometric figure. And this is a warning to Adrian, of course. And he is given a mortal wound. And he then, according to wishes, he has his relatives provide a tombstone, which is some writing or some text, but also a figure of the sphere encased in the cylinder. So it's saying the sphere is exactly 2/3 in volume of the enclosed cylinder. One of his best results one of his favorite results. I note here that the orator in prose stylist Cicero repeatedly searched for and found the tomb overgrown with weeds, and today it is a celebratory tourist attraction. So this may happen somewhere in La Réunion at some point. Years from now, of course. All right, so let me just mention, okay, so a few things that he built up, which I think are still quite worth mentioning, and some results that are still not resolved. A filter F over, it's just a filter, is a p-point if whenever you have a bunch of sets in there, I suppose it should be really descending, but doesn't matter. There's some set that's almost included in all of them. That's a p-point. And the Rudin-Kiesler ordering, very well known, is that if you have two, filters only, and they're both over the same index set I, let us say, though they don't have to be, then one is less than or equal to the other. One is just a projection according to this definition down to the other. So it's a natural notion. Finally, just for sake of notation, FR is the Frechet filter, the filter of cofinite subsets of omega. And the filter finally over omega is feeble, being as far away from being an ultrafilter as possible if there's a finite to one function such that when you project down to that, it's simply the Frechet filter. Okay, so I guess I'm sure it's, so you have omega, and then you might think of these finite to one. I should go up this way. And then you partition omega into finite sets, maybe little intervals, and then, as long as you have a few, if you touch a tail of them, you're in the filter. So it's not quite, you could have an infinite complement, but still it's very much like a Frechet filter. Okay, so if you have that, let me just mention, just to put it in the kind of classical context, Walter Rudin proved that with CH, there are p-points. And of course, he showed that with that, in beta n minus n, there are p-points, and then there are no p-points. So the space is inhomogeneous. Mathias showed early on that CH implies there's also an ultrafilter over omega with no points below it in the Rudin-Kiesler ordering. I should mention that in terms of theme, he used analytic sets in the proof, which is very nice. He also used, he gave also proof in the happy families of the silver result, in fact, a strengthening of it in terms of happy families. Again using analytic sets in the original sense. So, I'm sorry, well-founded relations occurred as a theory in Zermelo, let us say 1935 or so, but they first occurred in mathematical practice as really the meaning of what an analytic set, or rather a co-analytic set is in this study of well-founded trees. So well-foundedness comes from the work of Suslin, Lucen, and Sierpinski, and Adrian would always be engaged with this because of his, in some sense, also philosophical conviction that set theory is the study of well-foundedness. And it would always be that he would always use analytic sets, even his work of dynamics. And it's a kind of consistent theme of his work, and that gives it a certain amount of, a lot of power because of that. All right, so anyway, let's see. All right, so the next result is that if you, F is feeble, well, he showed that a filter is feeble in this sense over here if there's a corresponding family of subsets of omega, which is Ramsey, and hence that if you have the strong partition property for omega, that every filter over omega is feeble. And actually, is there something else? Let me just mention. Okay. So I guess it's the case, actually. So in Solovey's model, every filter over omega simply is feeble, and in fact, I guess there's a point that, in fact, feeble filters are exactly the meager filters in the Cantor topology, the compact topology to the omega. So if that's the case, you can also show that if you have the bare property alone already, which already holds in Solovey's model, then every filter is still feeble, because you can show that feeble is the same as meager, and meager have bare property. And also you could show the AD also does the same thing, because AD shows every set of reals is bare property, and therefore filters are. So you don't really need the strong partition property. Okay. Anyway, so I guess let me just move on. Yes. My part in the downfall is to mention, or at least to come to a point where I mention something called a coherent filter. So it extends the Frechet filter, is a p-point, it is not feeble. So at the time, the project was to show that there's a model in which there are no p-points at all. Of course, this was done eventually by Scheler, But as an approach to the problem, I propose that you might consider these three properties. So it has to extend the Fauché filter, it has to be a p-point, and it's not feeble. And Adrian showed that if O sharp does not exist, or the continuums have most alpha omega plus 1, then there are coherent filters, just as a theorem of set theory. So it's an elegant proof which used Ronald Jensen's recent covering theorem, so covering families with other families rather than sets directly with sets. So the question still, I think, is open whether in ZFC there are any coherent filters. And there's a nice paper of he, and I think it was Simon and Just, somebody else, where the study of coherent filters is taken to a further extent. But in any case, I think it's still open whether it's the case that there are ZFC filters. In ZFC, any coherent filters. All right, so let me mention the next. Okay, so in another direction, for a while, he studied things resonant with the axiom of determinacy, and the orienting result here is that in L of R, AD holds if theta is the limit of cardinal satisfied the so-called strong partition property, the one that generalizes for omega to any kappa. So with Jim Henle, he established a super continuity for functions and results about the Wooden-Kiesler ordering. And in the later paper with Henle and Wooden, assuming the strong partition property, the Hausdorff extension, well, it's you take the happy family of infinite sets, and you do what Adrian did, and at this point it's called the Hausdorff extension. It not only adds no new real, that was known, but also adds no new subsets of ordinals. Right? So if you could do that, it's really is a very barren extension if nothing happens there. So if AD holds, then in the Hausdorff extension of L of R, theta is still the limit of cardinals kappa having the strong partition property, but there's also a Ramsey ultrafilter. Suddenly AD will be drastically destroyed. So it shows that you don't have the Kekres-Wooden property holding as a characterization without L of R. So we could just add very quickly something at the bottom. And this is something Adrian will do many times. He'll just kind of fiddle with things at the bottom, and it will do a lot of things that destroy things all the way through. Okay. Let me just mention that during this period, no doubt with the fellowship of Peterhouse and intellectual stimulus, Mathias became rhetorically engaged. I'm sorry, there's one more thing I want to mention. So this is even better. You might say his capstone for determinacy. An ordinal is unsound if the subsets A and if it has subsets, a countable number of subsets, so that uncountably many ordinals are realized as order types of unions of these. So you can choose countably many subsets of an ordinal, and then try to form all kinds of order types from them by taking some of these and then put them together. So Wooden asked whether there is an unsound ordinal, and eventually showed that AD implies that there's one less than omega 2. Strictly as a matter of combinatorics in ZF, Adrian settled, I think, with very nice combinatorics. If omega 1 is regular, then every ordinal less than that particular one, an ordinal exponentiation, is sound. And if, moreover, the alpha 1 is less than or equal to continuum, then that is to say there's an uncountable well-ordered sets of reals, then that ordinal is the exact least unsound ordinal. So there is one, and exactly so in series ZF. So it's not clear that there is one just in ZF, but just with some hypotheses, minimal sort, you can get exactly the least unsound ordinal. Okay, so it's he uses a lot of work with the Milner-Rado paradox and in the composable ordinals, and it exhibits a certain prowess in combinatorics. All right, so here I just briefly touch on his sort of beginning work on sociological aspects and so forth, though I may not, or I should not necessarily do so. But anyway, he gave a paper in '78 to an undergraduate club talking about logic and terror, in which he discussed both the the law of exclusive middle and the law of contradiction, with some deftly potted history about these matters. And then he came and discussed the situation in the Soviet Union, there pitting formal logic, of which he was a proponent, against Hegelian dialectic. And he showed that, in some sense, after a while, Stalin sort of allowed formal logic to re-enter through a back door. So then after that, he wrote a paper on the ignorance of Bourbaki. It was actually a talk in '86, again to an undergraduate club, in which he talked about Bourbaki's early foundational work in set theory, and he showed that because of its ignorance of how it ignored Gödel's work on incompleteness, I'm sorry, it should be one word, and also that the set theory they fixed was quite inadequate, and this would be something that he would build on much later in actually doing some mathematics of trying to establish that this is the case. At the beginning of his worldly wanderings, Mathias engaged in a notable controversy in the classical sense of an exchange carried out in published articles with Saunders MacLean. This stimulated his subsequent engagement with the facets and aspects of so-called MacLean theory. The publication of MacLean's Mathematics, Form and Function in 1986 met with a resounding lack of response or even acknowledgement. One exception was Mathias's note, which took issue with MacLean's advocacy of a weak set theory sufficient for mathematics, and his contention that set theory cannot serve as a substantial foundation role because of its independent results. MacLean's theory was ZBQC, so set theory, ZFC minus replacement and with only delta zero separation. And he pointed out, Mathias, that this was inadequate for recursive or iterative constructions. And he said the spatial, that is to say geometric and temporal, arithmetic or iterative, are two modes that posit an essential bimodality in mathematical thought, and set theory buttresses the latter as a study of well-foundedness. In reply, MacLean maintained that his ZBQC does better fit what most mathematicians do, and that for the other work there are other foundations, and that there's no need for single foundations. To Mathias's veering towards set theory as a foundation for mathematical, as he said in ontological terms, MacLean opined, every mathematical notion is protean, thus deals with different realities, and does not have an ontology. A decade later, one might say this controversy continued, where Adrian wrote down another paper called Strong Statements of Analysis, where he pitted various people in different ditches. So there's the ditch of MacLean, there's the ditch of Bourbaki, and then there's even the ditch of ZFC stalwarts who do not accept anything further beyond that in terms of large cardinals. And so he gave a spirited defense of of large cardinals there. For example, that I guess there's several. Well, there's one that says that if sigma 1, 2 sets are universally bare, that would imply pi 1 sets are determined, and it would be nice to be able to provide a proof on pure results at that level of understanding, whereas it seems to be the case right now that you have to understand about sharps in order to go through this process. So for the first statement, it's equivalent to something like having sharps for all sets of ordinals. For the second, all reals. So if you know this, it's immediate, but if you don't, it's very hard to provide a proof from one to the next at the level of the kind of properties of universal bare and determinants are. So if you take these concepts and you try to prove them, it seems very difficult to do so. So he proposed that as a challenge. Now, it seems that MacLean sort of sidestepped that and just wrote a little note saying, well, my theory seems to be equivalent to something in category theory and so forth. So he didn't seem to address that, and at that point, the controversy ended. All right, anyway, so this in some sense stimulated, or at least led Adrian to study more about MacLane theory. So let me just mention a few things which may be quite standard. Zermelo set theory are those. So it's not really, it's a bit of a misnomer. Zermelo didn't really have foundation and, well, separation. There's a property, there's a problem of what is a definite property eigenschaft. And then the well-known Kripke-Platek set theory for admissible set theory is all those, to which Adrian insists on adding foundation for pi1 classes. Anyway, so these two are to be at the fount of a lot of things that he will discuss later. Collection I just mentioned is a version of replacement, for those of you unfamiliar, which doesn't have the functionality. Is simply for everything there is, and for everything there is, instead of for everything there is a unique, and for everything there is a unique. So the properties therein are just for bounded quantifier formulas phi. So his idea is that Z and Kp are somewhat orthogonal, and one provides set formation and the other recursive definition, and if you put the two together, he was able to provide what's called supertransitive inner model. Supertransitive, I guess, is a word from Shepardson, meaning that if you have a set and if you have an arbitrary subset of it, it's still in the model. And inner model meaning, of course, that has all the ordinals. And they can be recursively defined that exhibit evident failures of replacement, like, for example, that the heredity countable sets, a class is not a set. So there's very nice, elegant, and somewhat simple combinatorics that goes into it. You just have to ruin some things at the bottom and build things up through the hierarchy up. So very little of these sets engage in much of the Vn, so you could keep the level small, and then you arbitrarily build on top of that. All right, so let me mention the 128-page paper, The Strength of MacLane Set Theory. So I think this is a very fine, monumental paper in which a lot of things that have been done in terms of method in set theory and axiomatics is somehow definitively set out. So he first carries out von Neumann's classical construction with minimal hypothesis of an inner model of well-founded sets to effect the relative consistency of foundation as well as transitive containment. Transitive containment is the statement that every set is a member of a transitive set, and it becomes focal because it's an instance of use of replacement, but that's all you need to do a lot of other things. So Mac is essentially MacLane theory, but adding transitive containment because after all you have relative consistency, and M is Mac minus choice. I heard it said there was something called Big Mac, but I never found it I never saw it in the paper. Maybe it was just an illusion. Anyway, so then that's the first thing. You do the von Neumann analysis, and then you might as well throw in foundation and transitive containment. The second thing is he develops an axiom H, which in some sense, after the fact, becomes central, and that says that for any set, there's a transitive set, so that any set of size at most the original set, which is transitive, is a subset of that set. So it's sort of like having locally the H kappas around, and so you could sort of build these things. So with that, he approximates having Mostovsky collapses, that is to say transitizations of well-founded extensional relations, and sort of making isomorphic identifications under equivalent relations of certain sorts. He gets the relative consistency of having H. So you have con Mac implies con Mac plus that particular principle. So it's a local version of having a certain amount of universal H kappas. Drawing out the centrality of axiom H, Mathias shows that over a minimal set theory, H is actually equivalent to having Mostovsky collapses. So now you actually say there is Mostovsky collapse instead of approximating. And with a minimal Skolem-Hull argument that over Mac, H subsumes Kp, being equivalent actually to sigma 1 separation together with delta 0 collection. So H, he shows, is quite central to all these things. Then he simulates Gödel's recursive original set-by-set generation along well orderings, takes transliterations, and makes identifications as before for adjoining H. So his process, he later calls adding a loon, is sort of doing approximations and then being able to put things together at the end afterwards. So he works out condensation and gets this result that the consistency of M, which is a version of Maclane's theory, together with M without choice, and implies the consistency, as Gödel has shown, of U at Kp and V equals L. So this was a paper, this was a result he actually announced early on in the controversy with Maclane, to which Maclane was very happily engaged. Actually, it shows, and I think historically it's correct, that this gives the first explicit proof of con Z implies con Z plus AC. Now, Gödel, from 1930 to 31 to 35, tried repeatedly to build L on well orderings. So he would make well orderings, bootstrapping them, and then he would just try to go up along them. The point is that if you don't have the real canonical ordinals, you can't piece them all together all at once. So there's always this problem, and Adrian shows what that is with his looning, and so Gödel actually announced this result, but I don't actually think that he actually had a proof of that result. So because you have to do this construction very carefully in order to do so. So the point is, if you have the ordinals beforehand as given by replacement, then you could just go along and build the constructible hierarchy. But if you just have ordinals that are, bootstrapping with autonomous progression, so you get this, and some more well orderings are in place, and then you keep going, it's not canonical. And there's a kind of a deep problem that Mathias, in his work, I think, identified. Anyway, so with that, he next layers with the mediation of L the region between M and plus Kp and Z plus Kp, the difference being simply the levels of sigma and separation, and there's certain consistency results therein. Next, he develops a theory subsuming M plus Kp, first isolated for power admissibles. So what you do is you actually include in restricted quantification for all x subset of y and for x there exists x subset of y. So instead of membership, inclusion. And so actually a very careful and subtle syntactic analysis, he develops normal forms for these formulae and situates with p's everywhere, meaning that you use those as restricted quantification. He situates delta p0 in this larger theory. So actually it's a very elegant result that later he shows that in fact if you do that, if you add V equals L to Kp with this new business, that it actually proves the consistency of Kp. So it's it's quite surprising. It's diametrically opposed to other results along those lines without the P. Anyway, so he also proves nice results that even if you have this power and with the axiom of choice, and that every cardinal has a card, you still cannot prove H, and therefore sigma 1, the ordinary sigma 1 partition, separation. All right. Let me move on to very briefly mention, the Rep. Cole paper. He here, maybe this is a peculiar hybrid of replacement and collection. On the first side, you have the hypothesis of replacement for every y there's a unique C, and on the second side, you have just inclusion. So if you have a class function, the range on the set is just simply included. So in a way, it sort of is an add-on to his previous work because it's weaker than both, and he manages to show that, again, in the weak theory M, about the max theory without the axiom choice, together with this, you get the surprising result. You actually get all of ZF. So you don't have exactitude in getting a set, but somehow that's enough because, roughly speaking, you could create again the cumulative hierarchy. Every set has a rank, and therefore you could make it functional in order to have essentially the biconditional on the second side. Anyway, infinity can be effaced from both sides, and in fact, transitive containment can be effaced from the left, and even that makes it more dramatic, that just this property which is a weak version of either. Both collection and replacement is sufficient to get all of ZF.
The omega is the double.
Did I do something wrong?
Omega at the top.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. That omega should be a W. Yeah, I'm sorry. One would read it that way, I suppose. I'm sorry for the typo. Yes, it's backslash omega. I'm so used to doing that.
What is the right version? So you write omega. Omega
Well, if you replace this by biconditional, if you replace this by by biconditional, you have the usual replacement axiom that is exactly the range of a set. Right? And if you replace that, if you knock out the there exists, you have collection. And you knock out the unique. It's not functional. So yeah. So I'm sorry. If you knock out the for every there's a unique C, then that's just collection.
you want to have a set.
Oh yeah. I'm sorry. There's all kinds of things I should have added. A lot of parameters are leaving out in the full weight. And then if you make that biconditional, you have replacement. Okay. Let me mention, I'd like to just mention as a side note, though, because of our hosts here, that MacLean envisioned his foundational setting as sufficient for mathematics to include category theory. And I just wanted to add on thematically that with the Mathias controversy had turned into the possible necessity of strong, even large cardinal hypotheses. In recent affirmations, the very strong large cardinal property of Oppenka's principle has been pressed into display categorical consequences that all reflective classes and local presentable categories of small orthogonality classes. In collaborative work with Joan Bagaria and others, Mathias sharpened this result by reducing the hypothesis to having a proper class of supercompact cardinals, yet still drawing a substantial conclusion. And B, got categorical equivalence to Oppenka's principle, and C showed that as a consequence, the existence of cohomological localization of simplicial sets, a long-standing open problem in algebraic topology, is implied by the existence of arbitrary large supercompact cardinals. So maybe this is a way to think of it as an add-on to his controversy with MacLean and his insistence on weak set theories. Okay, now fortunately the next speaker is going to talk about dynamics, so I'm going to defer to him altogether and move on to other matters. So later, and I don't have much time, I just want very quickly to move through in fact, I think his finest work in this regard, which is captured in 3 papers. Well, first, the already very long 75-page weak systems of Gandhi, Jensen, and Devlin. So this study is quadriplegic without full delta zero correction. So you have delta zero separation, but you don't have the collection which allows the recursive power of iterative recursive constructions. So restricted separation is, I should mention that he's engaged in studying Devlin's benighted way of doing constructibility, showing that it's not going to work in his book. And so as he's trying to solve a problem. The problem was first with MacLean's that it's inadequate. Now he's trying to show that Devlin's axiomatization is going to be inadequate for certain situations. So anyway, so KP without delta zero collection is that, and then what he called Devlin basic is simply having Cartesian products, and then finally Gandhi-Jensen for having a certain form of replacement. So, and then there are further augmentations with restricted versions of delta zero collection and so forth. So I'm sorry about the time, but anyway, he builds a lot of models, over a dozen, and shows that there's a lot of independences. You could have DB and not G, J, and so forth. But his distinctive contribution is to add, again, with a very careful syntactic analysis, not that every Y is subset, but is a finite subset as a part of restricted quantification. And he adds that onto every one of these levels and shows, in fact, various corresponding separation and collection. And then he shows in quite a lot of detail that Devlin's constructibility falters at various points, and shows the minimal theory in which it would be the case that you could define certain things. So the Gandy-Jensen axiomatization plus infinity does work because it axiomatizes the rudimentary functions. And then he shows also that you could also have a parsimonious development of constructibility in Devlin's system, which is full foundation infinity in Devlin basic, as augmented by the single axiom S, that for everything the finite subset exists. And finally, he's got a very nice system, Devlin basic plus infinity, plus simply the k-element subset of any set are sets. And that's a very nice system which all these things can be carried out. Sorry that I'm rushing a bit, but anyway. So that work, in some sense, is a way of saying that you can get to the truth predicate by a minimal analysis. So it, in some sense, isolated the minimal sufficient basis for having the truth predicate, especially in connection with constructibility. Here, in work with Nathan Bowler, and he's getting at the minimal basis for being able to carry out the method of forcing. So you have axiomatics and forcing getting together. And I'll say very quickly, first there's the notion of if you have in KP you have sigma 1 recursion, here you have only the rudimentary functions of Jensen and Gandy, and you talk about rudimentary recursion. And then it turns out that it's those are not closed under composition, so you have to add something. You have to make them gentle functions, and those do, and that's a contribution of Nathan Bowler, that those are closed under composition. Then because you have to, when you talk about forcing, you need to have a parameter, the forcing partial order. You add that as a predicate there, and that adds new layers of complication, but also substance. And then with that in mind, so that you can carry out the forcing construction later, he defines the notion of a providence set. So it's a non-empty transitive closed under pairing, and for all x, y, and p rudimentary in that sense, it's closed under those functions f. All right. So let me just mention that here you write down first the individual Jensen functions, and you can sort of conglomerate them into one big function, and so that if you do it n times, then it's rudimentarily closed. Okay, I'll be finished in 1 minute. So then he defines a master recursion, and he shows that a provident that you could prove that in fact something called the provident closure of any set can be gotten by just looking at this particular hierarchy, rudimentary closed sets. It's a very fine detailed thing, so that if M is already provident, you have this hierarchy before you. Once you have the hierarchy, you could write down the finite set of axioms that generate that hierarchy. Every set has a rank, every set has a p corresponding to, and so forth, in such a way that you could prove that the transitive models of that are exactly the provident sets, and so that in the Jensen hierarchy, J nu is provident if and only if omega nu is indecomposable, and the only providence which is not satisfying infinity is the first level, and then you have all these other levels. It is on these that, though I'm sorry that I don't have enough time, he is able with the notion of providence to carry out in a remarkable paper the exact constructions of forcing that you might see in the Schoenfeld-Kuhnen technique, going right through and level by level. And for me, that's a remarkable paper, because there are choices along the way all the time, and the choices you make are a multitude, and each time you do something, something can go wrong. And so he has a way in which the technique of forcing melds with the axiomatics, so that it's exactly at a certain level. And to me, it's a beautiful paper. Anyway, so those are the results of our provident sets, and I'll conclude with that. Thank you very much. I'm sorry.
I'm sure Aki will answer any questions in person, so we'll resume very shortly at 10 o'clock.